15 million tons of bombs, a country devastated by napalm and chemical defoliants, earned the Vietnam War the unfortunate distinction of being the dirty war. Between 1955 and 1973, American soldiers joined forces with the government of South Vietnam to fight mercilessly against both the North Vietnamese army and the communist guerrilla fighters called the Viet Cong. At the end of the war, the death toll was extremely high: 58,000 Americans, 223,000 from the South Vietnam Army, more than 1 million communist soldiers, as well as hundreds of thousands of civilians had been killed. More than 40 years after the war, Vietnam has rebuilt, yet hidden evidence of the conflict is still there, under the earth, testifying to the violent combat that took place. Thanks to field research, to survivors who agreed to tell their stories for the first time, and to computer-generated reconstructions, you will discover the marks that this bloody story left behind. Dead soldiers' belongings, weapons cache, tunnels used by the Viet Cong, unexploded bombs that still threaten the population. These vestiges shed new light on this conflict that marked history. 20 years of terrible fighting that saw the United States and Vietnam embroiled in one of the most devastating wars of the 20th century. During the Vietnam War, the country was divided in two. In the north, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, a communist regime founded by Ho Chi Minh and supported by the Soviet Union, with an army of 500,000 men, its capital, Hanoi. In the south, the Republic of Vietnam was pro-Western and allied with the Americans. It had its own army of over 1 million soldiers during the war, its capital, Saigon. The border between the two regimes was considered to be at the 17th parallel. At this point, an area called the DMZ was demilitarized. Fighting raged on both sides of the line throughout the war. The first Americans arrived in Vietnam in 1955. At the time, officially, the government was only sending military advisors. At the height of the Cold War, they wanted to support South Vietnam, one of the last non-communist regimes in Asia. Under the cover of these supposedly temporary missions, they were in fact CIA agents who went to train the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Their objective? To teach the southern soldiers how to fight against the northern communists. But in the south, some residents refused the alliance with the Americans. They entered the resistance and created the National Liberation Front, the NLF, supported by North Vietnam. The Americans called them the Viet Cong. In 1961, Kennedy took office and greatly increased the number of troops in the country. The troops had a new mission: organizing search operations to dislodge and eliminate the resistance.
But there was a whole other thing that was going on with Kennedy, and that was this idea that the United States was going to start new military programs to cope with small-scale wars. South Vietnam was suddenly like a laboratory. It was like a test case where the Kennedy administration could try out things that it was thinking might help in other similar kinds of situations.
To support the Viet Cong, the Northern Communist Army created a network of trails that secretly gave pockets of guerrilla fighters access to the south, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Its purpose was to move supplies of food and weapons. The main trail went through the Truong Son mountain range and then crossed Laos and Cambodia to reach the south. Along the way, secondary paths fanned out, linking different zones to form a complex network, offering different alternatives in the event of an attack by the enemy alliance.
At the height of its activity, 120,000 people maintained the trail. There were transport units that coordinated truck convoys. There were artillery units responsible for counterattacking during American bombing campaigns. Army units to protect the trail day and night against the South's soldiers and the Americans. And of course, engineering units to protect, build, dig, and repair trails, which was essential.
The trail descended as far as Saigon to supply the guerrilla fighters stationed near the capital. Most of them were hiding 40 kilometers from the city, in the district of Cu Chi. Here, the vegetation seems to have buried all the remains of the war. Yet, an immense network of tunnels built by the communist guerrilla fighters still exists. In the region, the soil contains very strong red clay, often used as building material. Reinforced with bamboo roots, the tunnels from the war remain virtually intact. Huynh Van Tria is a Viet Cong veteran. He grew up and fought in Cu Chi. From the age of 17, he joined the ranks of the Viet Cong and was among those who dug tunnels under his region's villages.
We didn't have a digging machine, just our elbow grease. We had to use picks with very small heads because the earth was so hard that if the blades were too wide, they wouldn't work. To remove the soil from the tunnels, we used what we called ki, a sort of flat bamboo basket. Finally, we covered the end of the tunnel with soil to hide the entrance.
Begun during the Indochina War against France, the network grew over the years under the American occupation. The tunnels had 4 levels. The first consisted of shelters for the soldiers and traps for the enemy. The second, and the most extensive, was 4 meters below the surface and housed the headquarters where they prepared for combat. To compensate for the lack of oxygen, ventilation ducts made it possible for air to enter the tunnels. At a depth of 6 meters, the third level sheltered children, the elderly, and the wounded, operating rooms as well as stockpiles of weapons and food. A 4th level was dug just 3 meters above the groundwater table. Altogether, Cu Chi became a sprawling network of 250 kilometers of tunnels, allowing up to 16,000 people to hide.
This is going to be a methodical search, house by house, village by village, as we move north.
The American forces were aware of the tunnels, located just a short distance from their camps. They decided to teach soldiers how to remove the guerrillas from their hiding places. The members of this very special unit were nicknamed the Tunnel Rats. As the underground corridors were too narrow for stocky builds, the Tunnel Rats were essentially very young American soldiers or South Army Vietnamese able to sneak into the Viet Cong's hideouts. They flooded the tunnels, exploded bombs, whatever it took to flush out the enemy.
When there was an attack, we went into the tunnels. We knew the network by heart, so we could continue to fire on our enemies without them even knowing where the shots were coming from. We went like this, from one room to another, and we could not be found. We had to be prepared to stay in the tunnels for anywhere from 7 days to 3 months.
Trained soldiers ready to die in combat, a network of hiding places and ways of moving around camouflaged in the jungle. The communist side had many assets and knew the terrain perfectly. To weaken them, the American command decided to bring a new weapon into the conflict: chemical warfare.
The guerrillas' ability to ambush people and goods moving along the roads was a key problem for the South Vietnamese military. So the Americans had developed a defoliant chemical, and they employed it along the roads to suppress the vegetation.
In 1962, the US Army launched Operation Ranch Hand. Their objective was to dump powerful herbicides on the areas occupied by the Viet Cong to cut off their food supplies and clean up the jungle, making the fighting easier.
In 1962, maybe to about 66, 67, it took days or a week for the defoliants to take effect. Before the end of the war, when the Americans had actual Agent Orange, and Orange was only used for the formula that was called 2,4,5-T, or D, which was the most toxic. Then 24 hours.
Up until 1971, 48 million liters of Agent Orange were dumped on Vietnam. The Aloi province is among the most contaminated places in the country. The area is located very close to the line that separated the north from the south. Of the province's 1,000 square kilometers, 80% were exposed to US defoliants. Phung Tu Boy is an environmental expert. He studies the consequences of this chemical warfare on vegetation. He regularly collects samples from the area to monitor soil contamination.
According to the records, the Americans dumped defoliants on A Luoi 256 times, and the village of Dongson, where we are now, was the hardest hit. The planes flew over this village many times to spray their chemicals.
When Agent Orange was sprayed on vegetation, it weakened the stalk of the leaves, causing them to fall at the first gust of wind. As the spraying continued, the trees eventually died. But the Agent Orange formula also contained a poison with long-term devastating effects: dioxin. It traveled down the plants and eventually contaminated the soil. Over time, and because of the rain, dioxin eventually contaminated deep into the soil. Today, the amount of dioxin in the soil is 12 times higher than the maximum allowed for agriculture. Phung Tu Boy is trying to keep residents from reaching the areas most affected by defoliants. In the on-site greenhouses, he's growing a type of tree whose roots are capable of capturing dioxin from the ground and cleansing the soil. His goal is to restore the past's biodiversity to these forests and to bring back the animals that fled the war and the poison. Spraying defoliant began in 1962, but the bombing of the areas occupied by the Viet Cong intensified in 1964. Until then, US forces had officially only supported the army of the South Vietnam. But that year, an event would push the conflict to a new level. On August 2, 1964, in the Gulf of Tonkin, 2 American destroyers exchanged fire with North Vietnamese torpedo boats, an affront that Lyndon Johnson, the new President of the United States, could not accept.
To report that renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
The United States declared war on North Vietnam. A year later, they launched the war's largest aerial bombardment campaign, Operation Rolling Thunder, to massively bomb the areas occupied by the communists.
In the Vietnam War, the standard tactical aircraft in the US Air Force, the F-4 Phantom Fighter, for example, could carry a bomb load of 10 to 12,000 pounds. So a fighter plane in Vietnam was carrying the weight of munitions that a heavy bomber carried in World War II. If you look in Vietnam at the B-52 bombers, those B-52s were carrying 30 tons of bombs.
Napalm, a gasoline-based product, was quickly added to the list of aerial weapons. Its devastating effects characterize how terribly violent the air campaigns in Vietnam were. Located near the sea, Vinh Moc is one of the first villages north of the 17th parallel. the South Vietnamese army and the Americans attacked it by land, sea, and air. As such, the guerrilla fighters in Vinh Moc were on the front lines. At the beginning of the war, families built simple shelters to protect themselves. Ho Phan Trium was 20 years old when the first bombings began.
There were several types of shelters. I lived in this one. This type of A-shaped shelter could withstand both the shells from the American Navy and the bombs dropped by their planes. When the bombing became more and more intense, this type of shelter was no longer appropriate. We were forced to dig tunnels to live and to continue the fight to defend our homeland.
Inside this cliff, the residents dug a network of tunnels 2 kilometers long that connected the beach to the village. The ocean wind that entered could rise to the surface, ventilating the underground village. Inside, the villagers created everything that was needed for their survival.
This is a well. During the war, we could not go out to get water, so we came to draw water here.
The Vinh Moc tunnels housed an infirmary, an operating room, and even a maternity ward. Between 1965 and 1973, 17 children were born in the tunnels. Ho Thi Du is one of them. She lived her first years in these narrow rooms, which kept her safe from the raining bombs.
We used to call this our apartment. In reality, it was only a small room in the middle of the tunnels, but it was called an apartment because it housed our whole family. It was small, but 3 to 4 people could live here. Because of the war, life was impossible outside. And every family, no matter how big, only had one room to live in. We had nowhere else to go.
Despite the war, life in the tunnels was very interesting. I know it must seem unbelievable, but actually we were all very happy. There was a strong solidarity between us. We shared every small fish, every grain of rice. We also shared our potato or cassava crops if there were any. We ate together and fought side by side.
At the end of the bombing, the residents of Vinh Moc returned to live in the daylight. But above ground, the war had completely devastated the region.
We had no houses left, and throughout the region, the earth was strewn with all types of bombs.
At the end of the war, the residents resumed their daily lives, but now with the constant threat of exploding mines still hidden in the ground. The mission of the Vietnamese Association, Renew, is to eradicate this murderous pollution from the area. Its teams work to neutralize the bombs, mines and rockets that remain in the ground. Today, bomb disposal experts travel to a site where 325 lots have already been explored. They have already found 144 explosive devices. It only takes a few minutes for the team to detect an explosive device.
The bomb found this morning has been identified. It is a BLU-26 fragmentation bomb.
The size of a tennis ball, the BLU-26 bomb contains 85 grams of cyclotol, a mixture of TNT and RDX, one of the most powerful explosives in the world. Its defining feature is that its explosion releases 300 murderous submunitions in a 360-degree radius.
You can see here that when it explodes, it projects all these little pellets everywhere. It's very dangerous. It's deadly. Here, we are in a field farmed by peasants. It's really very dangerous. It's an extremely sensitive bomb. It explodes immediately, as soon as it's touched.
Among the other explosives frequently found by bomb disposal experts is the Mark II hand grenade, whose detonator is blocked by a simple pin. Once removed, the safety lever can be lifted, and then the grenade explodes after a few seconds. The bomb AN M47A3 is dropped from a plane. On impact, it delivers 33 kilograms of phosphorus. The explosion releases extremely powerful white corrosive smoke. Bomb removal experts have identified a total of 160 types of bombs, mines, and other grenades.
Here, it's part of our daily lives. We hear explosions all the time. As soon as you hear a noise, everyone goes out. And very often, you go to look for a body. We young people think that we can contribute to make this land safer. But it's true that it's a job where you can die every day. You leave in the morning without really knowing if you'll return in the evening.
Of the millions of tons of explosive devices used during the Vietnam War, an estimated 10% did not explode and still threaten the population. The Americans carried out more than 300,000 aerial campaigns to try to win the war as quickly as possible. But in 1968, after 3 years of intensive bombing, a totally unexpected event tipped the war. Much to their surprise, the Communist Alliance launched its greatest attack, the Tet Offensive. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, the country's most important holiday. Since the beginning of the war, the two sides had called a truce during that period.
On January 30th, 1968, when the Tet Offensive was launched throughout South Vietnam, it was a perfectly prepared operation. The Tet holiday is so important in the country that it would never have occurred to the Americans nor to the South Vietnamese Republic that the communist guerrillas would launch an offensive that day.
Hue, Da Nang, Da Lat, Nha Tong, Vinh Long. Altogether, more than 100 cities held by the South Vietnamese government were attacked simultaneously during the night. One of them was Saigon, the center of the offensive and the capital. To grab people's attention, the Viet Cong selected the most emblematic targets, among them the US Embassy, the South Vietnamese Army Headquarters, Independence Palace, and the national radio station. Weapons for the offensive were transported over the Ho Chi Minh Trail from the north to the Cu Chi tunnels. They were hidden in trucks transporting food and brought into Saigon. The North's guerrilla fighters amassed a gigantic military arsenal to launch the Tet Offensive in the heart of the city, right under the Americans' noses. One of the biggest weapons cache in Saigon was in the Tran family home. Almost 50 years after the battle, their son had preserved this historical landmark to the guerrillas in its original state.
These are the bullets fired during the night of the Tet holiday in 1968. Commando Unit No. 5 left from here to attack Independence Palace. During the offensive, the South Army soldiers discovered the commando's operations center. They launched an attack on the house. They were sure that there were explosives inside. This is the underground area where the weapons were kept. Behind it, there is access to the city's sewer system. In case of a problem, you could either escape through the sewer system or fight on site. Look, these are grenades. These are American, used against the Americans. These came from the Soviets. And these are Chinese. That's an AK-47. Its cartridge clip is still intact. A block like this can blow up a 3-story building. You just need to put a detonator there and to make one hole on each end. The wick lights the detonator that activates the explosive block. These blocks of TNT are very dangerous.
In total, 3 tons of weapons were stored under the Tran family home, all intended for the Tet Offensive in Saigon.
We hosted about 20 North Vietnamese here. They came in the evening to prepare their weapons and then drove to Independence Palace.
Despite all the preparations carried out by the North's fighters, the Tet Offensive in Saigon was a military failure. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, on the night of January the 31st, 1968, the Viet Cong managed to enter the United States Embassy. But in just a few hours, the American soldiers regained control of the compound and eliminated the attackers. From a military point of view, the Tet Offensive was a defeat for the communists, but their determination grabbed people's attention. The Americans continued to fight for 2 more years, but in 1971, they resigned themselves to the fact that they wouldn't win this war. Their soldiers gradually withdrew from the country. At the same time, they agreed to negotiate with the Hanoi government in Paris. They needed to leave the Vietnam War to the Vietnamese.
17 million people of South Vietnam have the right to choose their own government without outside interference.
On the ground, the North Vietnamese army wanted to strike an impressive blow. In March, their troops entered the southern part of the country. The United States decided to return to protect its former allies. Their bombings forced the North to retreat.
Both parties had already begun to negotiate, and the United States had agreed to withdraw from the country without the Northern Army having to leave the South. But they began to demand that the North Vietnamese army withdraw their troops. On the Hanoi side, that was not acceptable. That's why the United States played the last card they had left, striking Hanoi.
At the end of 1972, the Americans launched Operation Linebacker II, known as the Christmas bombing. From December 18 to 29, troops from the United States and South Vietnam came together one last time to bring down the North Vietnamese government. 1,700 bombing missions struck the capital of Hanoi. Over 9 days, more than 15,000 tons of bombs were dropped on North Vietnam. Phung Tu Boy is in the gardens of the Center for Assistance in Nature Conservation and Community Development in Hanoi. During the war, he worked there as a researcher. At the time, he was 22 years old. To protect the employees from the bombing, bunkers had been built in the gardens. On that day in December 1972, when the bombs began to rain down, Phung Tu Boy and his colleagues came to take refuge here.
Đây là một cái hố bom.
That is a bomb crater. We were in this bunker when the bomb exploded. Right there in front of us. The bomb made a deep hole in the ground, and the soil was projected upwards. The smoke from the explosion came in through this door. It rushed into the shelter. Our ears buzzed, and we choked. I remember we were shaken very violently.
In the center of Hanoi, the bunkers were built to accommodate only one person. The bunker Phung Tu Boy and his colleagues used was much larger. Up to 20 people could take shelter there. Its 2 entrances allowed the smoke from an explosion to evacuate quickly, thanks to the ventilation system. Today, the bunker is still covered with the dirt thrown on it after the explosion. Over time, the vegetation has regrown and has gradually begun to mask the scars of war. In the gardens, the bomb craters have been transformed into fish ponds.
After the bombing, we decided to preserve some of the craters. And to make them livelier, more joyful, we put goldfish in them. The end result counterbalances the dark image of the war that the craters symbolize.
The American bombing of Hanoi killed 1,600 residents. But the North Vietnamese Army's air defense managed to bring down over 80 American airplanes, including 16 B-52s. These were new losses that the United States could no longer accept. The Christmas bombing would be their last offensive in Vietnam. Nixon's government asked the Northern Vietnamese Army to return to the negotiating table. On January the 27th, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords marked the end of America's participation in the Vietnam War. The American soldiers left the country. Prisoners of war were released, and the North and South were supposed to respect the ceasefire. But contrary to the signed agreements, the ground fighting continued. Without its American allies, the South was weakened and endured the North's repeated attacks. After 2 more years of combat, the North Vietnamese tanks took the city of Saigon. On April the 30th, 1975, the South Vietnamese army capitulated. Vietnam was reunified. Afterwards, the whole country became communist. This radical political shift provoked panic. Thousands of southern Vietnamese tried anything they could to leave the country, to escape the re-education camps or even execution. More than 40 years after the end of the war, the bodies of many soldiers have never been found. The bodies of 300,000 Vietnamese and 1,600 Americans are lying somewhere in Vietnam. Jesse Stephen is an archaeologist. He works for an agency of the American government responsible for finding the bodies of soldiers who disappeared in combat. Its new project is located in the A Luoi region, only 50 kilometers from the old border. With the support of Vietnamese authorities, the team is on the trail of 3 American soldiers who went missing 50 years ago.
This area is one location where a U.S. patrol set out from the landing zone or the area around it, worked its way up and over this ridge and came down here into this saddle where they were ambushed by a Vietnamese patrol and sustained some losses.
In order to find the traces of the missing soldiers, Jesse and his team have to reach the layer that was above the ground 40 years ago.
There's a little piece of charcoal right here. It's a nice chunk of wood.
The presence of carbon proves that there were fires here. This layer of dark soil was probably on the ground surface during the war.
If someone buried someone here, they would be down in this layer. So we're going to follow this deeper.
The soil is moved to the sorting station, where team members pass each bucket's contents through a sifter. That's where Roger Antrim comes in. He is the US military expert who can identify the nature of the evidence found during the excavations.
Normally on sites we find a lot of bomb frag because Vietnam was most heavily bombed location. You may find a boot, you may find a parachute, some canopy, some survival items. Sometimes you're at a site it's well preserved that you can even still read the writing that's on the Band-Aid wrapper 40 years later, because it's been saturated with jet fuel for the last 40 years, so it just preserves everything. Let's check. We've got this.
Yeah, we had that more recent shoe.
This shoe from a Vietnamese soldier. If it might be.
All the items found will be sent to a lab in Hawaii. Here, on the other side of the Pacific, the evidence unearthed by the archaeologists is analyzed. The Pentagon has classified each case as confidential. While the investigation is ongoing, the experts can reveal neither the names of the people sought nor the place where they went missing. Today, Howard Maritaraji, one of the agency's experts, is investigating the crash of an F-4 fighter jet in Vietnam. During the excavation, archaeologists found several items in the plane's debris. Among them is a shovel that American soldiers used at the time, and a helmet, but also several other items that the expert was able to identify.
And in this case, we were able to duplicate one very important piece. Now, this piece is what we call a microphone bracket. And this bracket, there's only one per pilot, one microphone. Having two pieces meant that two personnel, two pilots, two crew members on that particular F-4 were not able to eject. Both of them hit the ground while still in the seat.
After analyzing the remains of the pilots' uniforms and equipment, the experts discovered what they had been searching for, clues allowing them to identify the victims.
This particular item is a watch, and the interesting thing during the time frame was all of these watches were serialized and assigned to one particular person, and the serial number can still be read off of this watch, and so we know exactly who this watch belongs to. And probably the best gift of all was finding his own dog tags. He was wearing every one of these items on his uniform. And so we treat it with respect, the way it should be, because these are the last vestige of his life.
Thanks to the work of the agency's experts, one of the pilots from the crash was identified. The government will speak to his family members first, before they release the information to the public. To date, more than 1,000 soldiers lost in Vietnam have been found. Ceremonies are held to honor their lives when their remains are returned to their families. It's a tribute that shows those who are still awaiting the return of a loved one that the American government will not forget them. In the Vietnamese culture, the souls of millions of dead are now watching over their descendants, who gather before altars built to remember the missing. Many cemeteries honor the communists who fought for the reunification of the country. In Bien Hoa, the largest South Vietnamese military cemetery was inaccessible and abandoned for many years. Today, the area has been renovated and allows everyone to honor the soldiers. More than 40 years after the end of the conflict, Vietnam is back on its feet and is slowly dealing with its history. Vietnamese people are feeling freer to talk about the long years of combat, which were among the bloodiest of the 20th century. A dirty war whose marks will never be erased.